Good afternoon, everyone. It's the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'd like to welcome you all to our Q&A session on penetration testing for HIPAA compliance. The most important thing to remember today is that you can ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located in the WebEx toolbar. I will monitor those throughout the hour and will get as many answered as possible. All attendees will be muted throughout this session, but please note that this session is being recorded and all attendees will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides following the presentation. A little bit about who we are before we get started. Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI QSA and a licensed CPA firm, providing assurance services to clients worldwide. Our firm has over 12 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as SOC 1, 2, and 3, PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST, FISMA, and ISO. We also have a variety of vulnerability scanning and penetration testing services. We do encourage you to subscribe to our blog, visit our library of recorded webinars. We have a new feature of our website that is tons and tons of free video resources, and we encourage you to connect with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'd like to remind you that this presentation is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is established by viewing this presentation. Should you need legal advice, please consult with your attorney. We're going to start off today with a little recap of last session, but before we get started, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Sean Rosado. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Jenna. So just a little bit about myself here. I mentioned this before if you were on the last webinar, but in the past I've worked for contractors for the Department of Defense doing network defense type of work. Transitioned when I came to Kirkpatrick Price into the offensive security side of this industry. And I lead the penetration testing team here, working on penetration tests and other security assessments, vulnerability assessments, that sort of thing. You can see there at the bottom some of the industry certifications that I have, if you're interested in seeing what those are. So the longer version of this obviously is in the recorded webinar from the last time around. So if you want to check that out, that Jenna mentioned just a little bit earlier. There's a whole library of those on the website, and I'm not sure of the specific location, but I'm sure that can be provided. But the idea is, what is penetration testing? Essentially, what we're looking at here is, we're performing authorized tests, against the network, to try and identify vulnerabilities against applications and infrastructure, to identify those issues before they can become a problem, and that sort of transitions into the why you should do it, and that's so that you can identify those issues, before a bad guy can find those first and exploit them and gain access to those systems or applications in your environment. And speaking specifically to HIPAA here, we mentioned this before as well, but there's no explicit you must perform penetration testing in the security rule or anything like that. But what there is what you see here in italics, just perform a periodic technical and non-technical evaluation. The rest of that is speaking of a specific subpart of the law there. But essentially what they're saying is, based on the risk assessment that's ongoing as a part of your, HIPAA compliance, regular duties, you need to look at those technical and non-technical aspects of the information systems you're trying to protect. Specifically, in this case, obviously, to protect against loss or unauthorized access of EPHI. And so in that risk assessment, you would be looking for, those sort of technical controls or technical assessment opportunities that you have to review those systems. And the most established technical assessment that you have is going to be a penetration test or a vulnerability assessment. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between those, at some point, I'm sure. But essentially, you want to be able to say not just we configured this system, but also that that we tested that configuration through some sort of active testing that again would be that technical assessment. Another resource that does explicitly mention penetration testing, and this is the introductory resource guide for implementing HIPAA security rule that was published by NIST. It's the special publication 866, and as you can see here, it says conduct penetration testing where trusted insiders attempt to compromise system security for the sole purpose of testing the effectiveness of security controls if reasonable and appropriate. Now, in this case, they're specifically talking about internal penetration testing. But if you review that risk assessment, as I mentioned before, and determine that there's a strong possibility that that an external attacker could gain access to systems that that are protecting ePHI or have stored ePHI, then you would extend that also to external testing as well.
Great, thanks for that recap, Sean. Like we said, that is our last session is on the website. If you just find the webinar resources page, you can listen to that whole hour recording. We're going to go ahead and get started with our Q&A. Our first question is for Sean. What is the difference between pen testing and vulnerability scanning?
I knew that was coming. So, so this is a very common question. I mean, when you're dealing with someone who's never, done either one, or maybe someone who has, regularly performed vulnerability assessments, but they haven't performed penetration testing. And there's a lot of confusion in the industry, by organizations that pass one as the other. Essentially, a vulnerability assessment is an automated plug-in or rules-based assessment. You can think of it as performing in sort of the same way as an antivirus would by saying, I know that this thing is bad, let me check and see if this thing exists. So a request is made to a particular port or service, to say, is this thing present? Is this port open? If so, is this service listening? That sort of thing. And so it's looking for, it has very little dynamic logic. So it's basically looking for a yes or no in most cases. Is this thing present? Is it not? Or looking for a particular string for a version number for software. So it's pretty static in the way that it works. So you get a list of vulnerabilities that says, these things exist in your environment, and here's the risk rating for those things. But not much beyond that. Like I said, it's heavily automated, not extremely dynamic. And so it can't really answer questions about, assume you get your report from a vulnerability assessment, and there are a couple of vulnerabilities that if you combine them would actually increase the risk in your environment. That can't be answered just by getting a report from an automated scan or vulnerability assessment. So penetration testing is that next step. So a penetration test doesn't necessarily have to involve a vulnerability assessment, but it is a good starting point to identify those sort of low-hanging fruit issues, those issues that can be quickly identified in the manner that I mentioned, just sort of an automated, quick approach. But with penetration testing, you can answer, the question, what if someone finds this vulnerability? So you can take a look at that issue, perform, manual testing against the identified issues, and say, here's a demonstration of what the real impact of this issue is in your environment. So that allows you to increase the risk rating based on, how far you were able to go, the kind of information you were able to obtain, and just get a more realistic view of what the impact to your environment is, through, again, that automated testing and through, manual effort from someone sitting there actually evaluating those issues.
That is a pretty common question. I know when I started out in this industry, I wondered the same thing. So that was a great explanation, Sean. Next question, should pen testing include a human element, or can it be done using tools alone?
Well, I think this kind of ties into the last question, where I mentioned that there's a lot of industry confusion about what a penetration test is. I personally don't believe that you can call anything that is fully automated a penetration test. If there's no manual effort, there's no ability to or effort put into attempting to verify those issues and determine what the real risk is. I just don't think that is a penetration test. So when I think of a test that's performed with only tools and no manual effort, I think that aligns with the vulnerability assessment side as opposed to full penetration testing.
Do I have to hire a third party to do penetration testing?
Well, that's a really good question. So the simple answer is the person that's performing your penetration test needs to understand what that means. They need to understand how to use the tools, the techniques that that a real attacker would. They need to understand common attack types. They need to they just have to have a strong understanding of what it means to do penetration testing. And it's funny, this one I think kind of ties back into the rest of the answers I've given so far as well, in that typically when you think of not using a third party outside, but you also don't have a dedicated penetration testing team or security team that understands those concepts and can leverage those tools effectively, what you end up with is a penetration test that's highly automated. Very little, if any, manual effort put into it, and calling that good because that's it's either a cheaper route or you perceive that to be as valuable as having someone behind a keyboard actually attempting to do those things. So I personally think that that you need a third party, but it's not required. If you have an internal resource that can demonstrate those abilities, then that's just as well. Again, you have to think about though what the reasoning is behind performing the penetration test. So some compliance requirements will recommend or require a third party to provide assurance for the things that you're already saying are happening internally, and to sort of sanity check and make sure that the ongoing security program you have in place is operating effectively and that sort of thing. So it's not an absolute requirement, but it is certainly worth considering if you don't have those resources internally.
Now this one is a little more HIPAA specific. If you're going to use pen testing to meet that technical evaluation requirement, how often should I pen test in preparation for a HIPAA assessment?
So I realize this is HIPAA specific, but the answer is somewhat generic. And the reason for that is that because HIPAA does not explicitly state that you have to perform penetration testing, then obviously there is no specific timeline for which that would need to be done. So when you look at your risk assessment, and I will go back to that pretty frequently because that is really the basis for any motivation on the penetration testing front. When you look at that risk assessment, you would be trying to identify what those risks to the data that you're protecting are, and use that as a driver for how often you should perform testing and what types of testing should be performed. And so, when you think about it that way, if you have very, very high value data that you think is significantly exposed or could be easily accessible, you would necessarily have to consider more frequent testing. If your environment changes frequently because you're a growing organization, and therefore there are a lot of network architecture changes, application changes, things like that. Obviously, that you would have to factor that into your risk assessment and determine what the appropriate frequency of testing would be. But there's no quick answer. PCI gives you must be done annually and other guidance factors there that just don't exist in the HIPAA world. So that's the best I have. But if anybody has follow-up questions on that, feel free to ask those, and I'll do my best to answer those as well.
Next question is, should I retest after remediation? And going along with that, should retesting be included with the firm that I work with?
Okay. So should I retest after remediation? I mean, I think the answer should always be yes. Most compliance frameworks that speak about penetration testing will, at least state that retesting must happen. Again, in this case, we don't have that. But when you perform penetration testing and you identify, significant issues that need to be corrected, it's not always clear that the particular fix that you did maybe needed a restart or needed, some other additional changes to be made in order to be effective. So it's important to have that resource to go back and say, okay, you've done what we believe is correct remediation. We're going to confirm that. So it can typically be a fairly quick process, but I definitely think it's really important to do that so that you're not left with that same vulnerability hanging out there because of a misunderstanding or an improperly applied patch or something of that nature. And so should it be included with the firm I work with? I would think that yes, you would want to do that. It's not an absolute necessity, but I would think that if you're performing a penetration test, you want to have that the remediation performed. That ahead of time. You should work that into the negotiation and the the structure of your engagement with that firm. Speaking specifically of Kirkpatrick Price, we do typically include retesting as a part of our projects. It's a targeted retesting, but it's something that we include pretty frequently because our clients need that, and we understand that necessity, and so we sort of build that in. So I guess the short answer is I think remediation is absolutely, testing is absolutely important, and that it should be thought of right up front when you're working to engage with a firm on this.
Great. Next question, how do I know which level of pen testing is right for me? What are the options? What constitutes a small, medium, or large engagement, or otherwise a standard versus advanced engagement?
Okay. So when we're talking about what level of penetration testing is right for you, I'm going to bring up the risk assessment again. You have to really understand, what the risks are to the data that you're protecting to determine the level and the scope of testing that you're going to perform. So when, if we have, for example, EPHI that's being, transmitted, processed, stored internally only, you don't have a customer portal or patient portal or something like that where someone can easily reach from the outside in. It sort of changes you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about application testing, for example, at least not on the externally facing side. You would certainly want to consider internal testing, and you may even want to consider, some sort of social engineering as a part of your penetration testing to understand what way someone from the outside could get in. And social engineering is a very common way of getting into internal environments through phishing emails, gathering sensitive credentials and using those to get access to those internal systems or to get access to an external system like a publicly accessible email server or something of that nature, and sort of trying to pivot their way in or gather more details to get access to the systems that would otherwise be internally accessible only. That's just, I guess, sort of an example there, but you would definitely want to understand what those risks are so that you can decide how much testing and where that testing needs to be focused. As far as sizes, you mentioned small, medium, large. I don't think of testing in the way of small, medium, large. I think of it as we need to understand where the risk is, as I mentioned before, and determine testing based on the ways that risk could be played out. So or the vulnerabilities associated with that could be exploited. So as far as sizes, I mean, we at Kirkpatrick Price don't really price something as small or medium or large. We think of it as how mature is your security program, and then base testing suggestions off of that. So if you've never had a vulnerability assessment, you've never done a penetration test, we start to try to understand what the best approach is to work from. Initially, maybe starting with just vulnerability scanning, and then working our way into penetration testing. In the case of the standard versus advanced that was mentioned there, I think that's probably someone who's heard of our standard service level and advanced service level. And the difference between those two is that the standard service level is a very, very basic process that can still be called a pen test. Essentially, we're doing a highly automated approach, so we are using primarily automated tools, but we back that up with manual testing once that's finished. Now, the manual testing is very targeted. It's specific to the vulnerabilities that were identified, so we're not going out and trying to really test business logic and other things on the application front, and we're not doing a significant amount of reconnaissance and back-end open source intelligence gathering and things like that on the infrastructure side. We're basically taking that automated approach, applying manual techniques to verify those issues and adjust risk rating as necessary, but that's really the extent of it. Whereas the advanced testing level is a lot more involved, includes man-in-the-middle attacks on the internal side, looking at broadcast and other types of network traffic that's going on and trying to determine ways to exploit that, pulling clear text passwords from that traffic, and just other types of techniques that do not lend themselves to that sort of static approach that a vulnerability assessment does. So that's the difference between those two, and really what constitutes, again, I don't know small, medium, large. I don't really know how to answer that part of the question. But like I said, based on that initial risk assessment, you can determine, what areas of your network need to be tested or what applications need to be tested, and then the size and scope of that application is a direct result of that. So, as you move out from those more sensitive systems, or the systems that process, transmit, or store that data, that's how you start to build that scope out and determine where that scope ends based on the risk that you believe to exist.
Next question, how do you choose targets in a space that has, something like 100+ IP addresses?
So I think 100 is a fairly small number, but it's a good question though. Typically as a penetration tester, you're looking initially for those easy wins. So when we have a scope, let's increase that to 1,000. Obviously during a penetration test, or maybe it's not obvious, not all of 1,000 IPs that are in scope are going to get equal treatment. It's just not an efficient use of time. There are going to be a number of systems that are very low value in that environment. So we're going to bring to bear what we know based on initial information gathering from the client, or from outside intelligence gathering from the initial reconnaissance phase, and try to understand what the most significant systems in that environment are, and focus on those. So we may then go down to a lower value target, or we may start from a lower value target if we, for example, identify some sort of, credentials for a lower value system. We might access that system with those credentials and try to perform attacks that would get us additional, access to that system, to then pivot to other systems in the environment, with the goal of reaching those systems that we consider to be higher value. Now, if we don't have that much information, you start to look at what most commonly has significant, information or sensitive information stored or managed. An example of that would be, if we're looking at environment, we see a significant number of servers, but we can't really pick out which one might be the most important. Maybe we don't even have DNS, so we can't resolve the internal IPs to host names. So maybe we just start to look for, okay, what's running on 1433? Well, that's Microsoft SQL Server. So maybe we'll start as simple as just trying usernames and passwords and things like that, attempting to directly attack that system before then dropping back to, as I mentioned before, other maybe low value targets to eventually pivot into those higher value targets. So it's different for every engagement. It's a very dynamic process, and it really depends on what we identify all the way through the attack process. But certainly, when we're talking about a significant number of IPs, the goal is to focus on those higher value targets first, and then if we don't have success with those immediately or directly, then to use other lower value targets to attempt to get to the destination. And hopefully, that's a clear enough answer.
Yeah. Since every, environment is so different, and since the IT landscape is just growing so much, how do you ensure that you have the correct resources or skills that you need for each environment to perform a pen test?
So that's a really good question. It's one that I get a lot. In a consulting role, I have a lot of, IT managers and things like that I work directly with. And some of those people have considered moving into the security space, and so they know through working with me that I'm probably a decent resource for ideas of where to focus. But as a penetration tester or even a blue team network defense guy, you try to look for those published resources from known researchers and research organizations. Just as simple as reviewing certain topics through YouTube videos can be helpful. It's not official, but those are excellent resources. My most common ways, in addition to all of the alphabet soup that you saw there with my introduction, I certainly look at the SANS training and attend that when I can. I have PCIP and again other industry recognized certification. I have those as part of my background. But where I focus most of my time to really stay abreast of new and changing technology is just looking at conference talks, looking at talks from again well-known researchers and penetration testers, and just understanding what it is they're working on and trying to apply that either in a lab environment on my own. Or just through understanding how those attacks work, in theory, in order to be able to apply those in practice, in the future. So there's a lot of great resources there. You can also, there are a lot of organizations and open source projects that are devoted to creating vulnerable environments and vulnerable applications and things like that for the sole purpose of penetration testers and would-be hackers learning how to to navigate through those environments to gain access to systems and attack, various types of vulnerabilities and things like that. So there's a number of resources, like I said, that, the professional, options of SANS and offensive security and those sorts of things. But what I find the most useful is all of those, just independent study, vulnerable servers, applications, things like that, where you can really get hands-on and sort of work your way through it and understand how those issues, can be leveraged so that you're better off the next time you actually have to engage with a customer.
We are about halfway through the hour, so I'm just going to remind everyone to use that chat or Q&A feature in the WebEx toolbar to continue submitting your questions. And another reminder to everyone that you will receive a link to this recording in your email by the end of this week, probably tomorrow sometime, so look out for that. Our next question for Sean is, what is the difference between a web application pen test and a network penetration test?
So web application penetration testing is specifically looking at the application, attacks that affect web applications. So we're not looking at ports and services. We're not looking at those sorts of vulnerabilities that you can see from the network layer necessarily, but specifically what can you do with this application when you're interacting with it directly. So the most common baseline for attacks against web applications is the OWASP top 10. So with that, we're looking for injection attacks and other things that would allow us to get further access to data within an application, or allow us to use that application, front end or API or whatever the target is, to pivot into the system that's hosting that. So again, it's very very focused on just the application and what's running on a web server, web app server, that sort of thing. Whereas, network infrastructure penetration testing, it is focused on all of those systems that can gather an IP on the network, whether that's static or DHCP. So we're looking at, firewalls, switches, workstations or endpoints, servers, and any other device that can, again, get an IP on the network and have some sort of security impact. That can include things like building controllers, keypads for, door security locks, things like that. So that's the main difference between those two. Is one is focused on the infrastructure, ports, and services. The other is focused on application-specific issues.
You mentioned API, and someone did ask a question about, does pen testing include API testing? So can you just explain what that is and if it plays into pen testing?
Yeah, so this question, the answer to the question is really, it depends on who you're working with and how they approach, web versus infrastructure testing or full scope testing. So for price, we typically consider API and or web application testing to be a unique and specific service for the reasons I just laid out on the last question. API testing is a subset of web application testing. And so, when we perform API testing, we very, specifically focus on the issues that we need to identify up front to be able to test an API, and scope it with that information. So it is sort of a subset of the web application, but it is a unique service by itself. That, like I said, each firm has a different way of packaging their services, and so it's possible that with another firm that might be included in a larger engagement. So just expect that to be, to vary from firm to firm.
I think we've already covered this one. The question is, how do you balance applying automated tools to the target versus something more manual, like someone at a laptop?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have mostly answered that question. I would prefer to just let anyone ask follow-ups if they would like on that front, and I can certainly answer those. But I think I've addressed that.
We did have multiple people ask if we have a sample report available, and we don't today. We didn't have one that was beneficial, so I didn't want anyone to think we're ignoring that question. Just don't have an answer for that one. Sean, could you talk a little bit about Kirkpatrick Price's pricing for pen testing engagements?
Yeah, certainly. I think I touched a little bit on this on the API testing question, but on the web application front, the way that we perform, our pricing and scoping is, first we want to understand what that application looks like. So that may be, by doing a direct review of the application, actually logging in, looking at the various functionality and pages and things like that. But the driver behind the pricing on that front is how many dynamic pages are we looking at? How many sections of unique functionality exist within the application? And so we do that either through just a direct interview of the client to understand the application, or like I mentioned, going through a hands-on review. So that gives us our initial sort of total, what we generically call page count. And then as we get more understanding of the application, we can sort of back out any duplicate functionality. And if we have multiple applications that are, for example, administrative versus standard user interfaces, we also try to understand what the overlap is there in the back-end code, so that we can adjust the price for that secondary application that shares most of the functionality, for example, with that admin application. So once we identify that, the page count is where we directly calculate our effort, and the effort obviously is where we end up with pricing. On the infrastructure front, sorry, I almost just left that part out entirely. So on the infrastructure front, we price, again, it's similar to web app, but we price based on the number of IP addresses that are in scope. So we don't charge a flat fee per IP address. But we have, we start with a certain, number of IP addresses that are included in sort of the first pricing tier. And as you go up, with certain numbers of IP addresses, that pricing, gradually increases. It's not a linear increase, but it's basically as we add more and more IPs, and I talked a little bit about this before with the question about, navigating large numbers of IPs. For the reason I mentioned there, that we don't necessarily give the same amount of effort to every single IP. As the IP count increases, when we're talking about effort, when we're talking about scoping, the pricing increases associated with that is decreased. So that's really the best answer I can give on that. It really is dependent on information that we gather and understand about your environment. But the biggest drivers there is IP count on the infrastructure side, and that unique page count on the web application side.
Great. I don't have any more questions coming through on my end. Sean, do you see any on yours? Sometimes WebEx is a little funky on the Q&A side.
I do not, actually.
Okay, good. Well, if you have any further questions, Sean's email is up on the screen, or my email is in your inbox with your registration email, so you can reply to that and send questions to me, and we'll get those answered If you have anything else about your organization's information security structure, please let us know. We're happy to help. And look for the recording of this session in your inbox by the end of this week. And that's all for today. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.
All right, everyone have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.